Om Shanti. As conscious beings, we have very naturally, easily, and constantly this essential power of awareness. Aware mostly of what's going on outside, but with a spiritual practice, I can learn to hear, to see, to realize, and ultimately to transform what's going on inside. In my inner world. Right now, very easily, I can be aware of what I'm seeing through my eyes, hearing through my ears, the feeling of my body, where I'm seated, the movement of the breath in my body. I have this awareness. And it is this awareness that allows me to experience these things. But then, what determines the significance I give these experiences? How I feel about what I'm experiencing. How I feel about it, think about it. All of this I can call my perception. Perception of what I'm experiencing, of what's going on around me, but even what's going on inside. I have awareness, but sometimes I'm realizing it would be helpful to be able to determine, to choose what I experience and how I feel about, think about, and perceive it, because I know that it will affect what I choose to do, my actions, my interactions with others. And so, a spiritual awareness becomes more and more essential to me, because it helps me to master my own experiences, so that I can then choose how I will respond to what I'm experiencing. I can be more accurate and compassionate. There can be more truth. And so I take the time to connect to that inner silence, that stillness at the core of my being. Anchor myself there. Knowing that in that silence there is power. There is freedom. There is truth, clarity. Allowing me to see truly what is going on outside and inside. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti, and welcome to those who've joined for Interview with Raj Yogi. We have sort of skipped over spiritual awareness and attitude part 2, but I think we would have to regardless. If you can tell, Judy has transformed. She might have taken a similar form, but not her form. This is actually Sister Tanya, and she is visiting from the Montreal Center. So we are very fortunate to have her here, and if she is open to joining next week for part 2, we'll just see how things go. But for those who haven't been joining in the series, we are looking at spiritual awareness, spirituality in everyday life, and just trying to gently make these connections so that we're actually addressing with the core, the heart of what these sessions are about is Raja Yoga. So it's very specific in terms of what Raja Yoga is for. And so Tanya has been mentioning in the reflection that we're looking now at how we have been looking at spiritual awareness, how that shapes attitudes, and how attitudes then shape perception. And so we always want to bring things back to spiritual awareness, which was why the reflection was very lovely. And it's interesting, when you were giving the commentary, I was thinking about how we tend to just try to do things directly. And you had mentioned about choosing the experiences that I want. We've been focusing a lot on awareness, and it seems to be, let's not talk about habit, just look at the lack of education, just this inner education that if we were just to look at, just change my perception, just see things differently, how is it that you find that that's just not going to be a sustainable thing to do?
Well, actually, one of the things that came to mind in reflecting on this topic, it's a phrase we hear quite often when we think about spirituality, and I'm sure you can relate to this. You've probably heard this many times, this idea of being present, to be in the present moment. And I always find that an interesting idea because, well, what if the present moment is just not something I want to be experiencing? I'm not enjoying the experience. I don't even really know how to manage myself in it. I feel I'm not in control, or I'm not particularly enjoying my reactions to what's going on. So to be in that present moment, or to be present, is actually feeling very unpleasant. And the idea that at that moment I can actually, that there's some other choice other than running away, or sort of numbing myself or trying to shut off, but that there's some other option, I find quite extraordinary. The idea that I'm just lacking the power to be able to, even the idea that I could choose my experience at that moment, especially if I find myself, finding myself in an experience that I've had before. And I've had a very similar kind of experience, and maybe several times, always when I find myself within a certain set of circumstances, and I'm trying to be present, but present how? That's what's so important. Yes, to be present, but what changes everything is when I can be present as a spiritual being. Because as a spiritual being, meaning that spiritual awareness, and obviously something I've been cultivating, not just telling myself, okay, I'm a spiritual being, but I've actually spent some time powerfully grounding myself in a reality, meaning I'm actually having an experience of myself quite different from when I'm just in an ordinary awareness. And how that then starts to bring up, if you will, it gives me access to a wealth of inner resources that I normally wouldn't have access to. And I like to call it a game changer. That through that I actually can experience my feelings, which we can sometimes refer to the attitude, how I feel about something that's going on, or think about it, that my attitude and can start to shift, and different feelings are starting to emerge. More sort of feeling of being more grounded or more empowered, more compassionate feelings. Clarity can start to emerge, very different from perhaps the sort of helpless or powerless or upset feelings that might have been previously emerging. And this is, it's magical. But in fact, it's a natural product of a spiritual practice.
Now, I just want to remind souls that if you have questions, you're welcome to type in the chat box on Instagram. Excuse me, or YouTube as well. Now, you're mentioning about being present, and it was reminding me about this it's pretty common practice out there of mindfulness. But you were mentioning about this awareness of being a spiritual being. Could you just explain a bit more the difference between mindfulness, just being present and just observing, and this study?
Well, in the word itself, so mindful, interesting, of course, because it suggests that perhaps your mind is full. But, of course, we use the word more to be, to be aware. To be mindful is to be aware, and I think merged in the idea of mindfulness, of course, is to be aware, but in a kind of caring way, with an attitude of care, of interest, of I think of a sense of belief in the self. There's these qualities, but again, they sort of depend on me having access to those qualities emerging when something perhaps extremely challenging or extremely disturbing is going on. To be able to just observe definitely requires practice. And yes, I think at times in my life, even before I had access to a spiritual awareness, I was able to observe and even be able to create some shifts in myself and move away, say, from feeling certain emotions beginning to rise up, just by the fact that I was acknowledging those emotions. So there's that aspect, I think, of being mindful, of you're observing and you're acknowledging, oh wow, I'm feeling rather upset. And sometimes to even acknowledge can be quite powerful. So all these things are very good. But I guess I personally have found it to be somewhat limiting for myself, or at least not as powerful as cultivating a spiritual awareness. And by that, and why it's different, I mean, the mind is what we understand. The mind is a faculty, a way the energy of the spiritual being that I am manifests, in that it's like a screen in which I can see my feelings, I can see my thoughts, and awareness, if you will, emerges within the mind. The mind doesn't choose what it's going to be aware of, but it's there that I can sort of, oh, that's what I'm feeling, that's what I'm thinking.
Kind of like an
Almost.
indicator.
Yeah, like I'm seeing it on a screen. But, you know, there are other processes in the spiritual being that I am that then give it meaning, that then determine, okay, that's the significance of that, or that's, you know, if that's what I'm feeling or that's what I'm thinking, then, you know, sometimes a certain reaction emerges. Another kind of reaction might emerge. Or I'm starting to make choices as to, okay, what do I do about it now? Do I feel powerless in the face of what I'm seeing? You know, what I'm observing, what I'm aware of. I may feel, wow, I'm really, really upset, for example. I'm aware that I'm very upset. I'm mindful to the fact that right now this is, you know, affecting me in this way. Okay, then what? I still feel that perhaps it might work, perhaps it might not. But what I find fascinating about cultivating a spiritual awareness, meaning taking the time to anchor into a depth of myself that I may not have ever had access to, certainly not in a very kind of proactive or conscious way. Maybe by accident I stumbled on it at times in my life. To be able to proactively and consciously anchor in and connect to a state of being where automatically I access a lightness, a letting go, a kindness, an understanding, a compassion, so that literally what I can experience, rather than having to try and work my way to not going into reaction, I access compassion. It's what emerges. So this is a huge difference from having to kind of try and construct something, if you will, based on, okay, I'm seeing this, so maybe I want to choose this, and it's, you know, can be quite involved. And it does require power, both of them. But one, I'm accessing a natural capacity within myself. But that requires that I acknowledge myself as that spiritual being and actually practice connecting to that depth in myself, beneath all of the layers of learned, you could say, or acquired reactivity or, you know, limited perception. So I would say this is for me the difference between the two. You know, one can require, there's more steps involved. It may work, it may not. It definitely puts the brakes on. I mean, it's certainly better than not doing anything at all, to at least be aware. You know, mindfulness, you could say, is a capacity that's extremely useful to a spiritual practice. But there's more that is possible, more that's available than just being aware, and then trusting that that awareness will somehow lead me to a better place in terms of what I may or may not do at that moment.
I found it very powerful when you mentioned it's that one can still have a limited perception, and that mindfulness, like you can't really, as you're saying, there's so much more. And so, just backing things up just a little bit, because sometimes I don't think we even realize, and especially for those who may not have a spiritual practice, or sometimes can feel challenged that spirituality is something that they're just feeling that they don't have time for. This aspect of perception, and that's why we mentioned at the very beginning, and I really appreciate we're always going back to it's awareness, because it was easy if we could say, okay, then just switch your attitude. But if you were there for the sessions, it's like, well, what kind of shapes your attitudes? Like, because I remember hearing from some individuals, and it's back to, again, do I understand the root cause of things? It's just reframe how you see things. Just reframe how you see things, and it'll change everything. And when you mention about limited perception, why does that not work in terms of, the core, again, of understanding ourselves as spiritual beings?
Well, I can maybe tell a little personal experience, but I'll start that, or just kind of introduction into that will be, um, this aspect of reframing or trying to change or limited perception. So, this idea of being present and being in the present moment. Well, the thing that's interesting or unique to a spiritual perspective, if you will, which is founded or is the product of a spiritual awareness, is that you're tapping into an eternal perspective. You're tapping into an eternal aspect of the self, which means it's much broader in terms of, let's say you have a bunch of information to try and understand a situation that's going on. Now, if, let's say, that information is very narrow, then your significance that you're going to give to that situation is going to be a function of that. If you have many more facts, if you have a much more balanced set of information, obviously that's going to change your understanding and perception of that. So to go from, say, a perspective that's limited to, say, what I've experienced, let's put it this way, in this lifetime, that's going to have certain limitations. But if I can tap into a much broader set of, if you will, information or experiences within myself, the spiritual being that's coming from an eternal perspective, well, that's going to have a very different impact on my perception. So coming back to this aspect of, a personal experience. So before I started a spiritual practice, there would be, this is going back a few decades, but there'd be moments in my life, and as an adult, where I would become aware that, and this very much connects to awareness, attitude, and perception, but in a more limited sense, because the spiritual aspect was not there at all at that time. But, I would become aware that when I would start to perceive others, like, I'd be walking down the street, an example, and someone who I don't even know is walking towards me. And I become aware that in just, my seeing that person, I could feel this attitude coming up, these feelings coming up that I was irritated just by this person's existence. I know that sounds a bit odd, but I'm sure
we can all
sometimes
relate
we
to.
feel, exactly. I'm sure we've all sort of experienced where just everything is irritating to us. And, for some of us, we blame it on the weather, on, the fact, well, this person's always irritating, or this is going on at my
Her
work.
hair do just irritates me.
Yeah, that, the way that person walks or talks or how they eat is irritating to me. But I just seem much more irritable. I've got this pain in my neck. I need to go see the chiropractor. Many different things we could. But I would become aware that, wait a minute, I am being irritated by this person for absolutely no good reason. So, there'd be this perception, there'd be this attitude, but there would also be this awareness that this is crazy, and I would ask myself, what is wrong? I knew at that moment I needed to take a time out, I need to go into a bit of solitude. I usually would sit quietly somewhere or lie down in my bed. And I would ask myself, like I was going in somewhere deep inside. I didn't know what I was doing, but I just knew that there was something going on inside of me that was creating these perceptions and attitudes that were completely irrational. But of course, they were affecting me because, bottom line, I didn't like feeling that way.
Yeah.
I didn't want to feel that way. Certainly not about someone who's done absolutely nothing to me. You know, I knew this is not how I want to be. So I would take this time, and consistently up would come some, it'd always be cathartic, and sometimes, there'd be very emotional, and some realization. So there'd be a realization of some sort, that some deep hurt or some memory or something would bubble up. And I go, oh, and it would come out and would be, kind of like the storm would have blown over, and I'd feel kind of reborn, and how wonderful, and oh, wasn't that good? Temporary. It would only last for so long, and ultimately nothing would be dealt with. It was as if the things would just sink back under the surface, back into the subconscious, and nothing was resolved, in fact. And then I would have the experience, a bit later on in life, of ghosts, things I thought I'd dealt with. I'd had that epiphany, or I'd had that cathartic moment, and I dealt with it. And there they were coming back again, ruining, ruining my mojo, getting in the way. And so, I was aware of this early on in my adult life, and I would think, what is the nature of this inner world? That these very subtle things that are going on, that are completely invisible, but they are creating havoc. And then I have to control my emotions. A lot of control is going on, but nothing is really being transformed. So there was realization, there was awareness, there was efforts being made, all of these things that we tend to equate with trying to move forward and being a better person. But it was very clear to me that nothing ultimately was really changing in a way that was in any way satisfying for me. And so once I started on a spiritual path, that for me was it was completely different, and it was immediately recognized or recognizable that this is creating change. This is tapping into a mastery I have never had, in the sense that, even though I'm not saying things can't come back, irritations can't come back, reactivity can't come back, I'm not suppressing, or I'm not just sort of kind of having some sort of thing bubble up and thinking, that's it, and then it, goes back down under the surface. But things are being cleaned out. And capacities are being accessed. This grace, if you will, in the self is being accessed. And the feeling is very different, because I'm not having to work, or I'm not tapping into pain anyway to somehow try and, it's not that's really being cleared out. It's literally a letting go. And it's like the spirit is being liberated to express itself. So imagine inside of you, you have these capacities that are there now all the time, but they're imprisoned. They can't see the light of day. But it's like imagine that they can slip little notes under the door, and you open them up. Oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And then you try and implement them, rather than the being itself being able to come out and just shine. You're just getting these sort of inclinations or these hints of what I could possibly be, or what I want to be. It's touching your heart. I don't want to be like this. I want to be like this. But it can seem like a lot of hard work.
it's like you're trying to produce light,
Mm-hmm.
and all you've got is, a couple of matches, and then they flicker out, and rather than this star that you are, that is literally imprisoned,
Mm-hmm.
and to let that out, to just shine. How much effort can there be in that?
When you shared about that, the irritation can still come,
Mm-hmm.
and you were mentioning about, there's all these capacities, and one of these capacities is detached observer, and it might be a new term for those who haven't taken the course, and so, but this capacity to, and it's a part of perception, this unlimited perception. How then do you find in your journey in this study that a very unlimited perception becomes important in terms of how you see yourself? There's something we call storms in this study where things come up in your mind, and this is obviously a backdrop of your journey as a soul, things that have happened, and I don't know how much mindfulness can really manage that. I can't comment on that. But in terms of just things coming up, as you were mentioning, I don't even know this person, things are coming up. And how has that been for you, this shift in your perception of the things going on inside, the feelings going on with soul consciousness?
So, in fact, it's helpful to find sometimes someone or something coming in front of you, and you can see the perception. It's flawed, it's perhaps negative or critical, judgmental in some way. And so, with a spiritual practice, because, in taking up a spiritual practice, connected to that is a deep desire to be positive, to be kind, to be caring, that you've realized there's a capacity for care in you, and also the desire to live that care. And so that becomes your intention. So in those moments where you're feeling you can't really, make excuses or, this person is this, that just doesn't wash anymore, because you have decided for yourself, and what's important to you now is, okay, I must do something about that, because it's not allowing me to live what I now know is my purpose and what will ultimately make me feel fulfilled and happy. Not that person goes away anymore, that's going to make me happy, but me using the powers I now have access and doing what I can, what I now am able to do and tap into, to change what, out of habit maybe, or just having backslid a bit and not actually maintained that capacity to be, if you will, we call it the detached observer. So there's a reaction, or there's some sort of irritation going on, storms, as Nora mentioned. And, when this is happening, immediately as someone who's practicing, anchoring or aligning myself in a spiritual awareness, you pause. You recognize what's going on, and you know that I need to reconnect to that still point, to that stillness. That the ability to be detached is not me going, okay, pull out, don't go there, don't think that. It's not about the don't, or not, or no anymore.
Which can be so habitual.
Of course, I don't want to think that. No, not that. Well, certainly it's good to be aware that you don't want to do it, but it's not enough. But at that moment have I practiced? And this is what the basis of a soul conscious practice is. That I am the brakes, that I am that point, and we call it putting a full stop. And the expression we use is become the point to put the point. So if I want to put a point, meaning a full stop to that, that kind of storm, or the emotions that are rising up, and of course they can be intense, but suppression, we know, isn't the answer. Just trying to will them away, ostrich sticking the head in the sand. No, that's not going to work. And it does take practice. It's not going to happen overnight. And yet, if I am just deeply interested, I have a disinterest in reactivity. If I'm deeply interested in that still point that I am, to be so fascinated that even as that storm's going on, it's kind of like, okay, great. What can my spiritual practice do about this? Not always so easy when there's huge emotions connected to that. And probably the most challenging within those huge emotions is a lack of self-value, self-worth. These are extremely challenging when the feelings, the thoughts I'm having towards myself are very negative, very dark, unkind. These can be huge, it's like kryptonite to a spiritual practice, to trying to connect to that sense of self as a spiritual being. Sometimes we'll call it giving it the silent treatment. Can you have all of that whirling around and all you do is you go to the eye in the storm? And you just say, great, okay, yeah, right now I feel these feelings, this loathing, this darkness towards myself, whatever it may be, but I am going to go here, and I'm just going to sit here. Because I know that in that stillness is the power, the safety, and, if you will, the qualities I need to master this kryptonite. And to go there, and I've experienced it, to literally feel myself being sucked into a whirlpool of how could you be so stupid? Yeah, have you ever experienced that? How could you have, you've so messed up? And have that switch to such blissful feelings. As it's like the soul just, anchored into the core, which is this pure, loving energy.
I really appreciate it when you were mentioning this piece, because you mentioned in the commentary about truth that there is a connection to the experience of that stillness and truth.
Yeah, this truth of the self, how to believe that. That how many times perhaps I've tried to tell myself or others have tried to tell me, no, you're not. Whatever it is I'm winding myself up into believing about myself that's not very useful, helpful, or positive. And yet, how do you know, sometimes the question, how do you know when you are there, when you're in that spiritual awareness? How do you know? Because without a doubt, that truth, that you are a diamond, that you are this precious, unlimited energy of benevolence, of kindness. And you are the first recipient of that kindness, that care. And there will be absolutely no doubt. You will not question it, because it will be a fact. That eternal truth of the self. And this is what we tap into in a spiritual practice. We are tapping into eternal truths. And because they're eternal, they're not relative to, they're not temporary, they're absolutes. And so the surety of that, it finishes anything else. And so we need those opportunities. We need to experience that.
We'll have to continue next week because something has come up with your share when it comes to truth, you hear that word enlightenment a lot, and it's being able to see yourself differently so you can have a different experience of yourself. So please come back next week, and we will have part 2 for spiritual awareness and perception. And we hope that souls will also notice that it's not like there's separate things. There's spiritual awareness, and then there's attitude, there's perception. This is all actually happening inside myself. And I need to be able to always go back to the seed to address things. But there's always indicators, and I need to be able to see what are the indicators and know what the solution is. And Tanya has really been very clear about the solution in the studies. I really have to go into that experience of truth, and that's something I think we often lack. We're just very good at thinking about things or analyzing things, but if anything, we're hoping that we just start to just be very aware that there's a solution. There's a solution to it. So,
and it's in me.
Exactly. So we will have a little reflection right now.
So a wonderful way that we're going into this, which is understanding that a spiritual perspective probably, first of all, needs to be turned on myself. And that the foundation of that's the result, or that's an indicator of the perception. But always, it's the awareness and the spiritual awareness that is the source. And I am both energy of awareness, I am it and I have it. And so a wonderful way to understand that is to experience it. If right now we can simply stabilize ourselves, I, this being of consciousness, I know that I sit in the center of my forehead, a tiny spark of life. And I shine out through my eyes. And if I simply hold my awareness as if I'm turning that energy inwards on the self, on I, the being, seated in the center of the forehead, that tiny star shining, radiating subtle light, filling my eyes, my vision. And in that vision, that seeing, I am experiencing the quality of my own being. That subtle energy that I am. How unlimited, how light, how free, how calm that energy is. And how joyous it is. Caring. And whatever I turn my awareness towards, be it someone or something in front of me at this moment, or even a memory, something that may have happened in the past, whatever I bring into my mind, when I am stabilized in this quality of being, the only feelings I will have
be woes of compassion, appreciation, understanding. And so simply through taking on a spiritual awareness, I can so naturally transform my perceptions about myself, about anything and anyone. Om Shanti. Take care.
Om Shanti. Just wanted to thank on behalf of everyone who's joined or will join. A big thank you to Tanya for joining with us. We'd like to hope she can join us next week, but we know it's her last evening with us, so we'll just cross our fingers. And Tanya, you've been in the study for quite some time. How long has it been?
I guess it's coming up to 23 years.
Wow, it's a lot of experience. It's really, really, really useful. So we really do appreciate your sharings, and at least I feel very lucky to have students that I connect with who really focus on getting the study very accurate and focusing on the solution that will shift things. And because it's pretty easy to sort of stay on the surface. I think it would also be extremely unfair to ask Tanya to tell us what's coming up next. So I will share on behalf of everyone and the center that so we have a new additional Hindi evening experience. We usually call it Hindi evening meditation. That's on Wednesdays now. So that's Wednesdays and Thursdays. The time has shifted though to 6:30 to 7:30. So Thursday used to be 6 to 7, but now it's 6:30 to 7:30. Same YouTube channel. Souls are also able to attend those on site, but registration is required, and that can be found on the website. The website is still in the midst of actually updating some things as well. We are also changing the topics for inner fitness that are happening on Saturdays. So there'll still be a session on Saturdays, 2 to 3, but we're going to change them to something we're calling it Om Shanti Cafe. But basically, it's going to be a whole lot more open and flexible in terms of what the topic is. Maybe we feel like it's an interview. Maybe we'll talk about aspects of Raja Yoga. So it's going to be a bit more open. Hopefully that would also be much more useful for individuals. And so we'll experiment with that and review. If you have and review at some point in time to see if we need to find something more useful. Other sessions that are coming up, we will be informing souls through the website as well as through email as well. But feel free to check the center's website for other sessions. Thank you again for joining with us tonight, and you're welcome to come back next week. So we have shifted the time to 7:40, just to accommodate the technical setup as well. So thank you again for joining. Now I gotta go to the back and play some music.